A catastrophic failure is happening right now, in plain sight, at the heart of the American West. And it's not what you think. This isn't about a drought. This is about a design flaw, a kill switch, embedded in the architecture of the second largest dam in the United States, that is about to permanently sever the lifeline for 40 million people. The dam was built to control a river. It is now poised to become a wall, a 710-foot-tall concrete blockade with no way through. Right now, an astonishing number of our viewers are not subscribed. If you value this kind of deep dive reporting, take 1 second to hit that subscribe button. It is the single most important way to support this channel, and it guarantees you won't miss what we uncover next. Let's begin. The engine of the crisis is a single number, 3,490 feet. That is the elevation of Lake Powell's minimum power pool, the precise water level at which the 8 massive hydroelectric turbines inside Glen Canyon Dam can no longer operate. Below that, the lights go out for 5 million people. But that's not the real disaster. The real disaster happens 120 feet lower. At an elevation of 3,370 feet, the reservoir hits Deadpool, the point where water can no longer pass through the dam to reach Lake Mead, Las Vegas, Los Angeles, and the farms that feed America. And the fail-safe system designed to get water through during a blackout? It's broken. We know it's broken because the federal government admitted it. In a quiet internal memo, they confirmed the dam's emergency bypass tubes are damaged, unreliable, and cannot be used. The catastrophic flaw has been exposed, the kill switch is active, and the lake is now just feet away from triggering it. This wasn't a sudden accident. It was a mathematical certainty, set in motion a full century ago. The story begins not in the canyons of Arizona, but in a hotel in Santa Fe, New Mexico. The date was November 24, 1922. The architects of the modern West, led by a determined Secretary of Commerce named Herbert Hoover, gathered to divide the waters of the Colorado River. They authored the Colorado River Compact, the foundational law of the river, a document that would enable the construction of colossal dams, the irrigation of millions of acres of desert, and the growth of cities that should never have existed. They divided the river's annual flow equally between the upper and lower basins, allotting a generous 7.5 million acre-feet of water to each, enough to build a civilization. There was just one problem. The water they were dividing didn't exist. Not in the quantities they believed. The measurements used to draft the compact were taken during one of the wettest periods in the last 1,200 years, an anomalous, freakishly wet decade that painted a dangerously optimistic portrait of what the river could provide. Modern tree ring data, analyzed by researchers like Brad Udall and Eric Kuhn, proves the truth they couldn't see. The river's long-term average flow is closer to 13 million acre-feet per year, not the 16.4 million the compact was based on. Today, with a 21st century megadrought fueled by a changing climate, that number is closer to 12 million. The 7 states of the American West wrote checks for water that legally exists on paper, but physically does not exist in nature. Every year, for 100 years, the basin has been running a deficit, a water debt that has been quietly accumulating. And Lake Powell is where the bill is finally coming due. Glen Canyon Dam, the physical manifestation of that 1922 promise, was an act of audacious, almost arrogant, engineering. Construction began in 1956. For 8 years, crews blasted and poured, transforming a remote stretch of the Colorado River in Coconino County, Arizona, into a monument of concrete and steel. When the gates were finally closed in 1964, the river began to back up, slowly drowning 186 miles of psychedelic sandstone canyons. It took 17 years for Lake Powell to fill for the first time. 17 years of the Colorado River's full, unimpeded flow. A volume of water that is almost impossible to imagine today. The dam was a triumph of 20th century ambition, built to tame a river and secure a future for millions. But it was built on a lie, a mathematical error, and a structure built on a flawed foundation will, eventually, fail. The question was never if, it was when. The dam gave its first warning not during a drought, but during a flood, a terrifying preview of its own vulnerability. In June of 1983, a massive, unexpected snowpack across the Rocky Mountains melted in a sudden heat wave, sending a torrent of water careening down the Colorado River. Lake Powell began to rise at a rate that terrified engineers. The reservoir, designed for control, was out of control. to prevent the lake from overtopping the dam itself, an event that would have been cataclysmic. Operators had to open the dam's 2 emergency spillway tunnels for the first time ever. These were concrete tubes, 41 feet in diameter, bored through the cliffs on either side of the dam. They were the release valve, the last line of defense, and they were about to be destroyed. As water moving at speeds over 150 feet per second screamed through the tunnels, a physics phenomenon known as cavitation began to occur. The sheer velocity of the water caused its pressure to drop so low that it literally boiled at ambient temperature, forming countless tiny vapor bubbles. As these bubbles moved into zones of higher pressure, they didn't just pop, they imploded. They collapsed with the force of microscopic jackhammers, unleashing temperatures hotter than the surface of the sun and shockwaves powerful enough to tear apart steel. Within hours, the spillways were vibrating violently. The imploding bubbles were ripping out chunks of the 3-foot-thick, steel-reinforced concrete like it was chalk. A low rumble grew into a roar that could be heard and felt for miles. Engineers realized the spillways were tearing themselves apart from the inside. If they failed completely, the uncontrolled erosion could eat its way back to the dam's foundation, threatening the entire structure. What does it feel like to be on the front lines of an engineering crisis that could wipe a city off the map? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. The scene in Page, Arizona, was one of controlled panic. With the spillways failing, engineers scrambled for a desperate, almost unbelievable solution. They drove to the local lumber yard and bought all the plywood they could find. Back at the dam, crews worked frantically to bolt the sheets of wood onto the tops of the massive steel spillway gates, creating crude, 8-foot-tall flashboards to hold back just a few more feet of the rising lake. They were fighting a trillion-gallon reservoir with plywood. For weeks, the fate of the dam and everything downstream hung in the balance. Eventually, the inflow slackened, the plywood held, and the crisis passed. The subsequent investigation revealed cavities in the concrete spillways as large as 35 feet deep and 150 feet long. The physics of cavitation had almost won. And here is the unsettling truth. The exact same force that nearly destroyed Glen Canyon Dam during a record flood is the single greatest threat to its survival during a record drought. Fast forward to 2026. There is no flood. There is a snow drought. An abysmal winter has left the Rocky Mountain snowpack at a fraction of its normal depth. The Colorado Basin River Forecast Center, the agency whose data determines the fate of the West, issued its spring runoff projection. Just 22% of average. The inflow into Lake Powell will be a trickle, not a river. The Federal Bureau of Reclamation's own 24-month study, the official projection of the lake's future, confirms the consequence. By December 2026, for the first time in its 60-year history, Lake Powell is projected to fall below 3,490 feet. It will enter minimum power pool. The hydropower plant will go dark. But the real crisis begins the moment the turbines stop spinning. To keep water flowing to the 40 million people in the lower basin, the Bureau of Reclamation will have no choice but to open the dam's last-ditch plumbing, 4 steel pipes near the base of the dam called the River Outlet Works. These are the bypass tubes, and this is where the ghost of 1983 returns. Because when you force high volumes of gritty, sediment-filled water through narrow pipes at low lake levels, physics gets vengeful. You get cavitation. And the Bureau of Reclamation knows it. If this analysis is giving you a new perspective on the West's water crisis, do us a huge favor and share this video with your family and friends. And while you're at it, hitting that like button really helps the channel. On March 26, 2024, the government quietly admitted the dam's kill switch was broken. In a bombshell internal memo, Richard LaFond, the director of the Bureau's Technical Service Center, laid out the findings from a 2023 high-flow experiment on those exact bypass tubes. The results were alarming. The memo stated that long-term operation of the River Outlet Works will result in accelerating regular operation and maintenance. It was bureaucratic language for a terrifying reality. The tests caused cavitation damage. The pipes were being eaten from the inside, just like the spillways in 1983. The memo confirmed that these tubes, the only way to get water to Lake Mead once the power plant shuts down, cannot be relied upon for the continuous, high-volume flows the lower basin needs to survive. This is the infrastructure paradox. The very structure built to guarantee the West's water supply is now the physical bottleneck that could choke it off. Once the lake drops below 3,490 feet, a terrifying sequence begins. First, the power generation stops. the 1,320 megawatt power plant goes dark, cutting off electricity to nearly 5 million people and, just as critically, eliminating the revenue that funds environmental restoration programs all along the Colorado River. The system starts to eat itself. Then, with the turbines offline, federal operators must rely solely on the damaged bypass tubes, pushing them to their limits, knowing that every gallon that passes through them is causing more internal damage, accelerating the moment of total failure. For 120 vertical feet, the terrifying gap between Power Pool and Deadpool, the dam will function as a broken valve, draining the last accessible water from Lake Powell to keep Lake Mead from crashing. But the bypass tubes were never designed for this role. They were designed for intermittent supplemental releases, not to function as the river's main artery. Pushing them to run non-stop is a gamble with physics. A gamble Richard Lafon's memo suggests they are doomed to lose. The final stop is 3,370 feet. Deadpool, the point at which the water level drops below the intake for even the lowest bypass tubes. At that point, it doesn't matter how damaged the pipes are. They go dry. The flow downstream to Lake Mead stops. Not a reduction, not a cutback. It stops. Completely. Glen Canyon Dam becomes a 710-foot plug. A concrete wall holding back a stagnant, inaccessible puddle, while a riverbed on the other side runs dry. That is when the water supply for Las Vegas, Phoenix, and Los Angeles effectively ceases to exist. That is when the 5.5 million acres of farmland that grow the majority of America's winter vegetables turn to dust. That is the domino effect. The people in charge are now in a state of open desperation. Camille Calamlim-Touton, the commissioner for the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation, has been forced into the role of financial and political executioner, delivering ultimatums to the 7 basin states to cut their water usage by millions of acre-feet. She speaks of management based on best available science, which is a diplomatic way of saying the cuts are no longer negotiable. The math has run out. In a move of sheer desperation, the feds have now turned to the reservoirs upstream of Powell. In an emergency action announced in June 2026, the USPR began dumping an extra million acre-feet of water from Flaming Gorge Reservoir, which straddles the Wyoming-Utah border, sending it downstream to artificially prop up Lake Powell's levels. It is a frantic, last-ditch attempt to keep the turbines spinning for just a few more months. They are robbing an upstream savings account to delay the inevitable bankruptcy downstream. It is not a solution. It is a headline. The failure of the bypass tubes has ignited an even more radical conversation inside the Bureau of Reclamation. They are now actively investigating engineering overhauls so extreme they sound like science fiction. The leading proposal? Drilling entirely new bypass tunnels, not through the dam, but through the solid bedrock of the canyon walls around it. A multi-billion-dollar emergency surgery to create a permanent bypass, getting water around the failing structure entirely. It's a plan that mirrors the third straw project in Las Vegas, another monumentally expensive effort to drill deeper to chase a disappearing resource. It's a tacit admission that the original design of Glen Canyon Dam is fundamentally broken for the climate of the 21st century. There's a growing chorus of voices, like the Glen Canyon Institute, a prominent environmental nonprofit, arguing for an even more radical idea. Stop trying to fix the dam. Instead, bypass it permanently and begin the process of draining Lake Powell. Let the Colorado River run free through Glen Canyon for the first time in 60 years. Their argument is simple and sharp. The reservoir is a climate catastrophe, losing hundreds of thousands of acre-feet to evaporation every year. The dam, a flawed piece of 20th century technology. In an era of sustained drought, the single most effective way to save water might be to get rid of the structure built to store it. All right, I know this is the second time I'm asking, but the data shows a ton of you who love these deep dives forget to subscribe. It takes one click, it costs you nothing, and it makes a world of difference for us. If you're still here, you're clearly one of the dedicated ones. So please, make it official and hit that subscribe button. We'd really appreciate it. The crisis has even forced the town of Page, Arizona, a city that literally exists only because the dam was built, to re-engineer its own survival. The town's municipal water intake pulls directly from the dam. In 2023, with the lake plummeting, the USBR had to urgently drill a new, lower intake pipe because the city was on the verge of its water supply dropping below its own valves. The dam was failing its own company town. The West is now confronting the impossible reality that Jennifer Pitt of the National Audubon Society succinctly described. We have 19th century law, 20th century infrastructure, and 21st century hydrology and water demand, and it's not lining up very well. It's an elegant summary of a chaotic collapse. The law of 1922 promised water that isn't there. The infrastructure of 1964 is breaking under conditions it was never designed to handle. And the hydrology of 2026 is rewriting the rules faster than anyone can respond. The future of Glen Canyon Dam is now a series of terrible choices. Do we spend billions on new tunnels to patch a failing system? Do we drain smaller reservoirs upstream to buy a few more months of power? Or do we face the most uncomfortable question of all? Was building this dam here, in this way, based on that flawed 1922 math, one of the single greatest ecological and engineering blunders in American history? The dam stands silent, a monument of concrete and hubris, baked in the Arizona sun. It was built as a symbol of humanity's mastery over nature, a machine to power the future. Now, it's a broken gear in a system collapsing under the weight of its own history. The water keeps dropping, the turbines are slowing, and the only thing standing between 40 million people and a dry riverbed is a set of damaged pipes that are eating themselves alive. The clock is no longer ticking, it has